Ladies and gentlemen, this is a great three-part series with Dr. Dennis R Mcdonald and Dr. Robert McNair Price. You really don't want to miss this. No one else out there has ever done this. MythVision Podcast has made history, and this goes deep. I even exit the arena to allow them to engage one another and have a fruitful conversation. I hope you guys stay tuned. This is part one. We are MythVision. I'm your host, MythVision Podcast, and my name is Derek Lambert. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. If you're new, there might be some new faces on the screen that you're not acquainted with or familiar. And this is why I'd like to go ahead and introduce the two scholars joining us today. We have Dr. Dennis R Mcdonald. He earned his undergraduate degree from Bob Jones University, a Master of Divinity from McCormick Theological Seminary, and a Ph.D. from Harvard University. He taught Theology and Biblical Studies at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado, from 1980 to 1998. He was the John Wesley Professor of New Testament at Claremont School of Theology and Professor of Religion at Claremont Graduate University. He also was the Director of the Institute for Antiquity and Christianity at Claremont. We also have Dr. Robert M. Price. Apology on the background noise, just letting everybody know it will go away. Dr. Robert M. Price earned his bachelor's at Montclair State University, Masters of Theological Studies at Gordan-Conwell Theological Seminary, and a Ph.D. in Systematic Theology, as well as a Ph.D. in New Testament at Drew University. He has programs called The Human Bible, the Bible Geek, and makes a regular appearance on MythVision Podcast. Today, I'm very lucky to have both of these gentlemen join me to be able to discuss each other's works, but specifically, we're going to be putting lots of weight on Dr. Mcdonald because we really, really, really love his works. Luke and Virgil was recently read by Dr. Price, and the Dionysian Gospel, which you have to get. If you don't know this material, you haven't considered it, you haven't seen how beautiful the Greek epics are in comparison to the New Testament authors of the Gospels, including Acts, you're missing out. There's no other way I can put it. And this is not exaggerating. This is not pumping books out to sell, okay? This is legitimate information that I have never heard anywhere else, and you carefully put it in a very organized fashion, so I encourage everybody to go check out their books. Dr. Mcdonald's books here. Oh, got Dr. Price up on the screen, right? Dr. Mcdonald's works here. He's got a ton of books. He's written more than the Bible itself when it comes to material, and you guys can go to Amazon.com, check out the books. I've got the link down in the description. Be sure to check it out. Dr. Robert M. Price also has a Patreon you guys can support. And in case you really want to earn salvation, just join that top dollar tier right there for $2.50 a month. He will make sure he puts gold letters on your name in the Lamb's Book of Life, so you'll enter heaven with a free pass. His website's here. His website's here. The PayPal donate link if you guys want to help support his works. And he also has plenty of books. I mean, like, I can't even count combined these guys how much they've participated in literature. And then also last of all, I'm like Paul, the least of all, and he appeared to me last of all. And here we have the Patreon. Guys, I launch tons of information. That's Dr. Goodacre, woman who's recently deconverted, and on and on and on and on. The material goes. Join the Patreon for MythVision. You guys can see this video itself will be launched on MythVision early, and you guys will see that. So we apologize for the lawnmowers in the background. It will go away eventually.
It will.
Be patient because the return of the Lord is soon. All right. Where do we begin, gentlemen?
Well, I guess I will begin by thanking Robert Price, whom I probably will slip and call Bob, for spending the energy that it takes to read through some of these books that get quite technical at times, and to ask some questions and probe some of the issues that are raised by these works. And I trust that we're going to have a good and energetic conversation about some of these issues, especially places where maybe the arguments aren't as strong as they would be elsewhere. But I do hope that at least the general commitments that I have in these books will get some exposure.
Yeah. Should I do something of an introductory nature or just get right to...
Whatever.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of what you just said about the arguments being weaker or stronger, one point I made in a review of your terrific book on Mark and the Homeric epics was that there are several parallels you propose that in themselves wouldn't carry a whole lot of weight, but that the reader needs to see that they need to see the forest and the trees, that some of them are so compelling, like the thing with the Gerasene demoniac and the Cyclops and so forth, that it's just, you got to be right on that, and various other ones, and that the death of John the Baptist and that of Agamemnon and so on, that what the reader needs to say is, you don't necessarily have to judge some of the others, like the number of the miraculous feedings based on the two outside suppers feedings in the Odyssey. You don't need to deal with them solely independently. That once you see that there is this solid basis for saying, look, come on now, Mark's got to be based on Homer here and here, then other things begin to look more you see new significance than you would if you viewed some of the others in isolation. And so they're not all the Mark and usages of Homer are not going to be as clear as each other. There's no reason to expect that, and so the others kind of take on new weight when you realize they're on the coattails of these biggies that can't really be denied.
No, that's exactly right. And, one has the same issue with parallels to Hebrew Bible, that some of the parallels are with the Hebrew Bible are transparent and others are less so. The way I describe it to my students, Bob, is the front range of the Rocky Mountains when viewed from Denver, where I used to live. That is, some of the peaks are obvious, all the way from Pikes Peak to Long's Peak and Mount Ball and others. But as you look at the horizon, some of the peaks get weaker and weaker. And at some point, you're not sure if you're looking at a mountain or clouds. But there's no doubt that there is a front range that is of mountains that is visible. Now, what happens with people who look at mimetic parallels is they'll deny that there are any parallels because some of them are so distant and weak. But the importance of the major parallels is to say, yes, there is a mountain range. Now, some of the peaks are going to vanish. By the way, in some cases, I agree with skepticism about these parallels when they're taken in isolation. But what happens, and as you know, the Guild denies that you have a mountain range at all. And so they pick on the weak examples instead of giving alternative explanations for the better ones.
Mm. Yeah, that's the old parallelomania dodge. Samuel Sandmel coined the term specifically to refer to circular arguments where you have like fragmentary sources that, insofar as we can read them, seem to have parallels with texts that are intact. And so when you assume that in the gap, though whatever was in there must also have been parallel to the ones that are actually attested, that's a valid point, but very specific. Whereas people, apologists, really throw around the term to try to disqualify appeal to attested parallels.
No, I remember going to that presidential SBL address that Sandmel gave, and I was convinced by it, and I thought it was useful. But over the years, I've developed my own term. It's called parallelophobia.
Yep.
And so that Sandmel's dictum, which was at the time a proper corrective, has now, I think, become really counterproductive to serious biblical scholarship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really apologetics, like so much of even mainstream scholarship is.
Yeah.
And that's just a cheap trick that I see pointed out in debates and used, I should say, in debates like I've had with William Lane Craig, for instance. And though that's only the beginning of sorrows with him, there's all kinds of cheap stunts like the appeal to majority, and others are famous for that too. But I'm a little surprised that there's been that much mainstream consensus reaction against the Homeric parallels and so on. I didn't think people like Crossan and others were that phobic about that. Is it because they have various political and theological reasons to believe that more of the narrative is historical rather than literary?
Well, I actually have written something on that related to Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And I really appreciated what he did. He talked about the problem of paradigm shifts inside of what he calls disciplinary matrices. And that is, you and I, and almost all active biblical scholars now, were trained in a vacuum of classical Greek poetry. We had indexes to parallels to the Hebrew Bible. We had redaction and textual criticism, and we know how to handle texts in that way. But we had no. For example, the Nestle 27 has over 3,000 allusions and citations to the Hebrew Bible and 5 to classical Greek literature, and only 2 to poetry and none to Homer or Virgil. Now, so we have a dearth of critical resources available. And even today, just recently, there have been 2 books on the on New Testament scholarship and so on. Mimesis is entirely absent. People do not consider imitation or mimesis as a part of the exegetical task, even though in antiquity we know that it was foundational to composition. People learned how to imitate, and they did so often to rival their social identities with the classical world. Virgil's a good example, but so is Lucian. And so I don't think it's sinister. I think it's short-sighted, and I think it comes out of the kind of formation of the biblical scholarship at its highest levels even. So that it's what I would call a kind of philological fundamentalism, where there's not an understanding of art, of creativity, of literary combat, so that we compare the text to supposed historical events and memory, but we don't compare them to antecedent literatures with the sophistication we need.
What do you make of Thomas L. Brody's work with the parallels between especially the Deuteronomic history, I guess, but and the New Testament, where he does the same sort, I think, of careful scrutiny almost microscopic in the good sense. I mean, nothing escapes the guy, and suggests that the story of Ananias and Sapphira is based on that of Achan and Naboth's vineyard and so on. I find it really impossible to deny this, and he does it throughout, and to the point where I came to the point of feeling. I read his books and that of several others who did the same thing on a smaller scale. And I wrote something that appeared in the Encyclopedia of Midrash called New Testament Narrative as Old Testament Midrash. And it seemed to me that virtually every story in the Gospels and several in Acts are simply rewrites of various Old Testament stories. I gather he's considered a heretic, though his books get published too. But what do you make of his work?
Well, Tom and I are friends. In fact, twice I was his guest in Limerick for conferences and giving papers and so on. So I very much respect, and he's a lovely man. I don't know if you know Tom.
Just correspondence, but
he's a terrific fellow.
Mm-hmm.
And he's generous with classical Greek poetry. So he, for example, compares the Odyssey, the Joseph cycle in Genesis to the Odyssey. And so I don't know if he's published that, but we've talked about it. And so he's generous to these things. But take a look at his work, Bob, from a distance. You would have to say that some of his examples are really quite strong and others are not so. So it's this business about the mountain range again. Yes. But that there is such imitation, I think, should no longer be doubted. But here's another issue that you used the word midrash. I think we are way overdue in having a conference that talks about midrash and mimesis, because what the Greeks called mimesis, Jews called agadic midrash, and the systems are different, the educational patterns are different, but they both are what scholars now are calling rewritten scripture. And so I think you're bringing a midrash is altogether right. And I think Tom is one of the bridges between midrash and mimesis.
Yeah, he's amazing, as you are. You guys are really like the two witnesses, it seems to me, really casting a whole new flood of light on these things. In fact, I like to claim to carry on this rewriting scripture thing with, I did a story based on the Gerasene demoniac and the pigs and Circe and the whole deal, called The Son of Jehovah versus the Cyclops, in which I retell the Gerasene story with added details. I'll have to email you the story, but that is really endlessly fascinating. I gather you're not a total mythicist when it comes to Jesus, and I do not consider Jesus mythicism some sort of a dogma. It's a theory that seems the most plausible to me, but I'm all the more curious about what it is that you think is that convinces you that there was a historical Jesus at the base of this. This isn't a challenge. It's a sincere question.
This is obviously a very complex discussion, and we can only skim the surface, I trust. But I will give you the general outline. I think for me, the most important witnesses to Jesus are Paul and the Q document, not the canonical Gospels. And I do have an alternative reading of one passage in Josephus, not the Testimonium Flavianum, but the business about James, the Lord's brother. And I've gone round and round with Carrier on this matter. But the Q document, in my view, requires that Jesus be a real person who challenged Jewish, what I call the Torah enforcers in Judaism. And this is where, for me, one finds the violation of the Sabbath to allow gleaning or healing, or you tithe the mint and the cumin, but you abandon justice and love. I actually put the story of the woman caught in adultery in Q, where Jesus forgives her, even though Moses says women like that should be stoned. And there's nothing outrageously unprophetic of Jesus in the Q document. Now, if people are skeptical about the Q document, like Mark Goodacre and so on, that argument seems not to hold. Even in the books that you read, I don't do much articulating of social identity criticism or social identity theory. But social identity theory is a remarkable new hermeneutic that has been employed without name in biblical scholarship for a long time. And it goes something like this. All social groups have self-stereotyping, where they identify their values and their prototypical leader in a certain way that gives shape to their movement. One can think about Trump and Wingnuts and so on as the in-group with the prototypical leader. But there are also stereotypes of outgroups. And then there are barriers and narratives and rituals that divide the stereotypical in-group from the out-group. And we can see this in the Gospels. Your own work has shown that you have a diversity of villains in the various Gospels, different Christologies in the Gospels, and different, what unfortunately is called ecclesiologies in the Gospels, which is nothing more than self-stereotyping. And the Q document has a distinctive form of social identity marking. And its prototypical leader, Jesus, is not a Christian martyr who dies for people's sins, who is raised from the dead, but is rather a prophet who is giving an alternative interpretation of law. He's the promised prophet like Moses, but he is humanizing and making more compassionate Jewish law. And I think it makes sense that somebody like that gets executed, because you run amok both of the religious authorities who are the Torah enforcers, including Sadducees with the temple enforcers. I think the temple word, I will destroy this temple and build another, comes from the Q document, and that's enough to get you executed. So I think there's a pattern of portrayal of Jesus as the prototypical leader of this stereotyped in-group that includes the 12, that is really quite distinctive from the Gospels. In fact, the Q document, in my view, is not Christian at all. It's a Jewish document that thinks Jesus is a pretty cool prophet. And so for me, there's a coherent and attractive and historically compelling picture of Jesus that emerges from the Q document that gets reshaped and mythologized in the synoptics, but nonetheless attests to a historical person. Now, the issue of this challenge to the law characterizes also the Pauline mission. Although Paul's issues are somewhat different, he also is a Jew who is attempting to transform Jewish law to make it more embracing, in this case of Gentiles, and the restriction and the removal of certain Mosaic or Abrahamic requirements, such as circumcision and so on. So that's my, now, that said, you and Richard Carrier and others are quite right in saying that the canonical portrayal of Jesus, their Christologies, are heavily mythologized. But it doesn't mean Jesus didn't exist. It does mean that you can't trust the Gospels to be reportage. They rather are mythic and meaningful portrayals of Jesus for different social situations. So if we had time, I'd be happy to walk through the Synoptics and the Gospel of John, identifying how those social identity markers shift. And the Christology shift because the sociology shifts.
I found that does make sense to me, but it reminds me of the argument of Burton Mack that convinced G.A. Wells, of course, a big mythicist, that there was, after all, some real Jesus at the base of the thing, and that was that if you whittle Q down to Q1, that you find that there, and by omitting the bracketing the Christology and stuff like that, you wind up with 7 distinct topical sections that all sound like ancient cynicism. And when I read in this the book of Q or whatever it was, the Lost Gospel, the text separated that way, I found that pretty convincing. What are the chances that it would fall neatly into these sections? But I thought Mack and Wells were jumping the gun when they said, you see, you have here a distinctive voice that matches cynicism, so Jesus must have been a cynic or like a cynic. And I thought, well, wait a minute, to come up with that sketch of what the cynic voice was like, the cynic position, you compare it with parallels from several different cynic authors. So what you have is there is a consistency, and they're right to point it out, but it seems to me it's the voice of a movement, not necessarily of an individual. What they're saying is the personality or whatever of Jesus shining through. That's going too far. I think it could be, but it could be Pseudo-Crates or any of these guys who parallel these statements. So that I think the definite cynic Jesus sort of dissolves under scrutiny, and it's less likely. And I think Jesus becomes kind of like King Solomon, or like Poor Richard's Almanac. It's like a title almost more than a name, though, as you say, there's really nothing in there to say that these sayings were originally attributed to Jesus. We now read them in a narrative context where Jesus said, like the Gospel of Thomas also. But it's in those cases, it's pretty clear that the name is just it represents a kind of a failure to grasp what wisdom literature is, that you don't need an authority to have said it to make it believable. The whole idea is that in a wisdom saying, a proverb, an aphorism, it's the content itself that convinces. It's something you wouldn't have thought of, but once somebody says it, it rings true. You say, yeah, why didn't I see that? You don't need it. It's not like something you take on faith because Moses said it or John of Patmos said it. No, you can see the truth, and it doesn't matter who said it. Could have been Albert E. Newman. It doesn't make any difference. And so I'm skeptical as to whether a distinctive Q position and social identity necessarily means that there was a historical founder of it. But of course, can't prove it didn't. But it seems to me way up in the air.
What do you do, though, with Paul?
Well, Paul has, I think the old mythicists were right that it is shocking that if there was a Jesus tradition of any kind of sayings, you'd never guess it from reading the epistles. I mean, that doesn't mean there was no historical Jesus either, but Jesus wasn't even a teacher in the Pauline epistles. In 1 Corinthians 7, where F.F. Bruce used to love to point out that, early Christians didn't throw in their own stuff with Jesus and make him a ventriloquist dummy, because Paul says, not I, but the Lord. Yet that settles the whole thing. I mean, do you ever hear of the Nag Hammadi texts? These guys were fabricating Jesus sayings all over the place, and they just ignore those because it's like fundamentalist Protestants saying Catholics aren't Christians. Like these Gnostics, well, they don't count. What are you talking about? And I sort of think that that Paul is dealing with revelations, like even from the ascended Christ, or the Christ that never came down to earth, who knows, when he says just a few chapters later, if anybody thinks he's a prophet, let him recognize that what I write to you is the word of the Lord.
So, what do you do with the Pauline requirement that Jesus is the crucified one?
Well, that gets into the stuff that gets Carrier laughed out of court, though I don't think it should, that if the archons and the principalities and powers crucified him, it would make sense to say, well, he means that they're the power behind the throne of the Romans, etc. But in fact, in the epistles, in Romans and in 1 Peter, we're told that the Romans don't punish the righteous. Like, how could you have said that if you thought that the Romans framed and killed Jesus? It makes me wonder if instead he is talking about the kind of weird stuff we read about in Revelation, where you've got the lamb that was slain from the foundation of the world, and so on. I suspect that you could have had a non-historical crucifixion in the mind of somebody like Paul, since he doesn't lay it at the feet of Rome.
Okay, I'll just say I find that preposterous.